Hello again, welcome back. I am going to follow up on the last video that I did where I reflected on meaning of the Tower of Babel story and um, and really, and I talked a little bit about my fascination with, well, maybe it was the Egyptian pyramid. Where did those thoughts come from? Um, there, in our study of literature and culture, um, when those two fields come together, really it starts to open one's mind of different possibilities. And this I'll mention some books. I'll mention some textbooks. So we started way back in our first kind of couple of videos with this, talking about life in biblical Israel. And so you can kind of see, to visualize what it might have been like living in biblical Israel, where it's a very agrarian society. Up until the 1900s, most people lived in farming communities and smaller agrarian society type life. It's not till the 20th century where we see the industrial revolution and a majority of people in the world living in cities. And so you can kind of see there's a picture of what a small compound might look like with extended family. And obviously they're not going to possess a copy of the Bible or scrolls. They're going to be living out amongst where their crops are grown, so they can actually live and subsist. And that's most of human history has been kind of a subsistence living, where people are, their primary activities each day are gathering what they need to eat and food and meal preparation. And so it's hard to overestimate kind of the idea of how unique it is that we really have surviving texts. And also it's important to identify that the texts that we have really came from ruling classes. Usually if you're a scribe, you've been trained and you have money, and the kings like to have their deeds and acts remembered. So that's when things start to get recorded. Here's a house. You'll notice that people sleep upstairs, and then because the resources are limited, you've got animals and stalls downstairs. You can imagine the smells. It's not like our 21st century where we expect people to shower and bathe and be clean and be all put on their cologne and perfume. You can see that the animals were down below and the people slept upstairs. And that was a typical pillared house, for at around 1500,000 BCE. So it's really interesting to think how much different and how foreign that the ideas of life were. And so when you read many of the passages in the Bible, it's really important to recognize how those things were written, to whom, under what context, because the things that were written for people that either live like this or even in a subsistence way in in cities, even then quite different than, so we need to be careful we don't extrapolate the wrong meaning into life today. um, for instance, I'll go a little bit farther. um, in early, you'll notice themes throughout the Hebrew Bible where there's commands against worshiping other gods. Baal is one of them that's mentioned. um, and they're really, when you have these commandments, typically if people know anything about laws and commands not to do something, it's because that was being done. And so it was really common practice. If you look at some of these older, well, looking at older the life of people in ancient Israel and Judah, um, people were worshiping many gods. It wasn't like it just there's a whole fascinating anthropological and historical cultural view of how Israel came to be and Judah came to be. And and what we know from literature is especially from the Greco-Roman era, where people, rulers talk about how victorious they were, and the victor go the spoils, and you get to write about how awesome you were. There's some of that evident in the Hebrew Bible. There's some, what they did possess a very important, at one time around 1000 BCE with King David and King Solomon. I would venture to say that that era where they, you have Assyrian power kind of shrinking and Egyptian power kind of shrinking, and the consolidation of power in Mesopotamia around, that's a land bridge. That's a very, very important geography. It's connecting Europe and Asia and Africa. And so, for instance, to give you some context here, where you've got Africa and Europe and Asia over there, and really the only way through to those three continents is here, because this is all desert. You're not going to make it across this desert. And so there were great migration routes through Israel. And so tactically, that's a very important piece of land to possess. And you're like, well, what about all the sea? Sea travel was very, very, the boats, the construction was very risky. It's much easier, or much more reliable to get around on foot and on land. And so that was an extremely valuable piece of land. And so, you do see, I think, and I think historians would agree with this, maybe, how you confabulate stories a little bit to show how awesome you are. There's some of that present. I mean, definitely in any type of history from that period, there's if you're a ruling class, there's a little bit of that present. Unique to the Bible, this is, I think, what gives the Bible its whole character. Unique to the Bible, as I said, to the victor go the spoils, and unique to this culture. And it's really, it's interesting because it survived. Typically, you don't have records from the losers, right? And I'm not calling people losers. I'm just saying people who lose the battles, who lose the politics, who are conquered. Typically, you don't get surviving documents, surviving records, and we have that. That's to me, and so remember, you were once a slave in Israel or in Egypt. You have that theme kind of running out through the Hebrew Bible into the prophets, and into, even thinking about Jesus and Jesus' concern for the poor and people who are oppressed. And if you're getting beat, you want people to be merciful. You want to have some grace shown toward you. And that's the amazing thing to me about the Bible, and it's one of the amazing. There's many amazing things, but that's one of the amazing things. There are, and a good segue into this next piece. There are a lot of surviving I want to call them documents. There are a lot of surviving, whether it be tablets, scrolls, just writings. That's probably a better term to use. Writings from Sumeria, Babylon, Persia, the Hittite Empire, Assyria, Egypt. There are a lot of Old Testament parallels. And so, for instance, there's a story called the Enuma Elish, and it looks to be of Sumerian origin, pretty old story. And there's a story of a flood in there, and it is literally, if we went over the flood stories, it's, oh my goodness, it is too close to the flood stories. And it's like, well, and so you're like, well, yeah, if there's a parallel, that means it actually happened, right? So, for instance, you remember that time when I talked about, Noah sacrificed after the flood ended, and the smell from the sacrifice pleased Yahweh. And here, like, I'll read some of this. So this is from the Enuma Elish. This is a completely different document, not any ways. in the Hebrew Bible. On day 7, I released a dove, which flew but returned. There was no place for it to rest. I released a swallow, that's different, which flew but returned. There was no place for it to rest. I released a raven, which flew, cried out, and flew away. The flood had subsided. Then I released all the creatures because they were in an ark. there was an ark in it. It even talks about how to build the ark in there. I built the holes. And so you think about the Elohim story. The Elohim story is really considered to be written by the priestly writers. Were they looking at this when they wrote that? Did the folks that wrote this, the Bible apologists would say they were looking at this? I'm gonna give you a little different idea about this. I sent out my sacred vessels. I kindled a sacred fire of reed, cedar, and myrtle. The divine assembly, the gods, smelled the aroma. They swarmed like flies around the sacrifice. And so, again, you're like, well, they stole that from the Bible. The dating of this doesn't correspond with that. This is something found in archaeology, very ancient. They've had other people put together the story, and so there are other parallels as well. And you can see this is pretty thick. And so that's what originally got me thinking about, well, since this story is here, maybe this, and also the dating for the stories are pretty difficult. The earliest intact, if we're talking archaeologically speaking, the earliest intact evidence of Hebrew culture were the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so dating right around 0 CE, right around the time, contemporary of Jesus's life, written by the Essenes, a sect of Jews who were separationists, who kind of took away from society and took to more of an ascetic living, and so these scrolls, validated back 2,000 years. It's a pretty good record, pretty good. But even the records that we found with these tablets were older, and so it's like, as an archaeologist, where you're trying to find, like, what's the evidence? What's the evidence? Should I say that these tablets I found, which were older than Dead Sea Scrolls, should I say that? Should I assume that they read the Bible, and so they're trying to copy the story? These parallels, or do I go with what the evidence says? So you're already stepping into kind of this faith versus fact versus evidence, and it gets tricky. Because folks, we're taught, or if you're Christian, you're taught, well, if you don't believe, you're sacrificing your salvation. So there's that mind trap that okay, well, I'm going to believe this first. That's not how the scientific method works. That's not how Galileo discovered that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Galileo looked at how the stars appeared to move in the sky, and in relation to what Earth was doing, and was like, and then Mars and the planets, and was like, that none of this makes sense for Earth to be central and everything revolving around the Earth. It doesn't all revolve around us. It makes a lot more sense for the Earth to be spinning and the Earth to be going around the sun. Copernicus, Galileo. Galileo was imprisoned. Galileo spent his life basically in locked. Well, it was a not the worst lockdown, but it was he didn't recant what he found. The Catholic Church. There is a place in Joshua. I think it's Joshua 10, and God made the sun stand still. Well, then obviously the sun's going around the earth, because God made the sun stand still. And that shook. That was, I mean, really, you have a heretical stance. And so Copernicus, Galileo, with these observations, are going against the church. that's the big thing about even today, where you have contradictory evidence. The church fights it tooth and nail. And you, like I said, fundamentalism, in at least in Christianity, I'm a pretty good student of that, is a result of this scholarly knowledge because it's threatening this belief. Faith and belief don't have to be enemies. And in fact, in factual information, don't have to be enemies. I'm wanting to go through this and continue to illustrate why. These are excellent books, Biblical Exegesis, To Each Its Own Meaning. This talks about different methods and approaches. You can really have some sophisticated ways of, I mean, you could have a historical, trying to look at the historical record and try to understand what the Bible says. You could just look at the canon and try to find, okay, what does it mean in the canon? You could look at source criticism, which really what I talked about with an oral tradition. What was the actual oral source? What did it say? Because it's evident there's editing, there's redacting, there's more than one author. Gosh, I'm getting kind of nerdy. Sorry. This is one of my, this has been probably the main passion throughout my life for understanding this, because again, the implications set tradition on its head and really call into question a lot of the presuppositions we have. And I think it's important that we question those. I really honestly do. And you're like, well, that contradicts this faith and this, and you know, if your faith can't stand up to questioning, what good is it? Well, I'm just going to ignore everything. That's not when the evidence comes raining down on you. I feel like that's what we're doing in our society. We're just ignoring evidence at this point, and I feel like it's connected a lot to this. Anyway, I will stop there because there was a lot of heady information, and I'll pick it up again. See ya.